Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to have you with us bright and early on a Sunday morning. I am very excited to be chairing this panel. One, because I know literally nothing about museum archives, so I'm very keen to learn. And number two, because I know that our speakers have so much experience to share with you all. And thirdly, where different disciplines intersect, I think, is where you often find some of the most interesting work in our sector. So I'm really excited to learn more. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to kind of introduce themselves in turn and kind of explain a little, just to begin with, just explain who you are and where you work, and then we'll come on to career paths and things. Would you mind starting, Sophie?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm Sophie Jemma. I was until 3 weeks ago Sophie Town. So I've recently got married, so you might find me online with that. But I work as the archivist at the Warner Textile Archive, which is part of Braintree District Museum Trust. I have only been there for 3 weeks, so I can't talk extensively about that role just yet. But prior to that, I was digitisation and archive assistant at Bletchley Park. And alongside my paid work, I'm also a trustee at the 100th Bomb Group Memorial Museum, and I've been there for about 5 years. It's quite an active member of the board.
Thanks. And Carly?
Good morning. My name's Carly Randall. I am currently archivist at the V&A. Before that, I was archivist at the Horniman Museum and Gardens. I'm also training officer for the section for archives and museums, which is a special interest group within the Archives and Records Association of the UK and Ireland.
Thanks. And Gary?
Hi, I'm Gary Haines. I'm the archivist for the RAF Museum in Hendon. I've also been in the profession for about 20 years and worked in various other positions, such as in the Whitechapel Gallery, the V&A Museum of Childhood, and the Mercer's Company.
And Rosie.
Good morning, my name is Rosie Taylor. I am currently a curatorial archivist at the BFI National Archive. Before that, I was in the US. I worked for George Eastman Museum and also then a humanitarian organisation called CARE. I worked in their archive there before I came to the BFI. I've been at the BFI about 2 years now.
Oh, amazing. And a whole different kind of breadth of different kinds of archive here as well, which is fantastic. Lots of people in all the different platforms that we have been asking about career paths into working in archives and museum archives in particular. So I wondered if the panel wouldn't mind sharing kind of what your route into your current role has been, or your route into the sector more generally. And would we be able to start with you, Carly?
Sure. Okay, so my route into this sector, it was almost kind of accidental. As a young child, I wanted to be an archaeologist. So that was my first degree, in archaeology and anthropology. But after a while, I realized that the subject was really interesting, but not necessarily the career path that I wanted to take. So I started looking up other jobs where I could make use of my archaeology degree. I think they were in alphabetical order, and I only got as far as the A's. So I found archivist. And I thought, actually, that sounds really interesting. I read the description and it was basically me. So I decided to go for it. And what was really good was that there were so many archives, because I'm based in London, tons of archives, lots of places to get volunteer work. And the first time I started handling archive material, I realized, yes, this is what I want to do. So that was great. So I volunteered for a year at 3 different places. So I was at, let me see if I can remember, I was at Trinity Laban, which is a dance archive, Westminster Diocesan Archive, which is a Catholic archive, and the Royal College of Surgeons Archive. So it's 3 very different kinds of collections that I worked with. I was then lucky enough to get a year-long paid internship at Lambeth Palace Library. Lambeth Palace is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they have a huge library and archive. So I worked there for a year. I was very fortunate. I was there with 2 other assistants, one archive assistant and another library assistant. So we were able to gain a huge amount of experience, lots of older, more experienced archivists to mentor us. We then all went to UCL to do master's degrees in our various subjects. I did the UCL Masters in Archives and Records Management. I qualified in 2011. So a lot has changed on the course since then. There's been a lot more of a move towards teaching students about digital records, a bit more of an emphasis on records management, but some things on the course are the same. So I did that course full-time for a year. Then I was sort of let out into the wild to do work. I stayed at Lambeth Palace for a little while longer. But then it became sort of more difficult to find permanent work. So I was in temporary jobs for quite a while. I applied to Sue Hill, which is a recruitment agency that does a lot of recruitment for information, records, knowledge management, that sort of thing. And I was able to get some really good temporary work. And the first temporary job they got me was at the Horniman Museum and Gardens, working as a project archivist, cataloguing their collection of building plans, and that was really interesting. And that was my first time working in a museum. The Horniman Museum is like a medium-sized museum in southeast London, and it's a really, really fascinating collection. And that was where I got my sort of first experience. It's quite a small archive, but it's a mix of donated material, but also institutional archives, so records that have been produced by the museum that tell you about all the different kinds of jobs that the staff do there. So that was really, really great. It wasn't until a little bit later that a permanent post came up at the Horniman Museum. And so that's when I got my first permanent job, was as archivist at the Horniman. I was there for 2 days a week for 4 years. But I learned so much while I was there. The Horniman is a very generous, friendly institution, and that's where I started to learn more about museum archives and how they work. I did do some other part-time jobs as well, but the work at the Horniman, that was my absolute favorite, and I was there for 4 years as their archivist. Then a permanent full-time role at the V&A came up. And I promised myself, I knew by then that I wanted to work in museum archives if I could, and I promised myself that if a job came up, that I'd apply for it, even if I didn't think I'd get it. And I didn't think I'd get it, but I did. So I've been at the V&A since July 2019. Unfortunately, I've spent almost as much time furloughed as I've spent actually getting to do the job, but I'm now back at work this month. And I'm really, really enjoying being part of such a large institution.
Oh, amazing. Thanks so much, Carly. Sophie, would you be able to tell us a bit about your route?
Yeah, sure. My route is not quite a straight line, I think I would say. My specific archiving experience is from my current role and then my role at Bletchley Park, and also from working with the Butlins Holiday Camp collection. So they have quite a large corporate archive, basically based at the History of Advertising Trust over in Norfolk. So I had a background in that was straight archive really, rather than a museum archive, but they had a lot of 3D objects as well. And when I joined my team at Butlins, I was the only one within the team of archivists that had any kind of museum collection background. So I was given responsibility for the 3D stuff basically as part of my remit. So it really overlapped in terms of the collection. I actually did a collections management traineeship with Norfolk Museum Service. And that was based at Gresson Hall Farm and Workhouse. And that was actually working with large social history objects. So wardrobes, canoes, that kind of stuff, really massive stuff in the large object store. So kind of quite different to archives work. And then in between all of this stuff, I also worked for a period of time as Arts and Heritage Outreach Manager at the Corn Hall in Diss, which is actually a kind of community performing arts venue. We had a large auditorium and we would do film shows, live music, theatre productions, but we also had 2 gallery spaces, which I was responsible for the contemporary exhibition, commercial exhibition spaces, as well as community engagement exhibitions as well, so local museums and local artists groups and things like that. So, and before I was a trustee at the Bomb Group, I was also working as cataloguing a photograph collection as well at the museum. So I've had kind of a wobbly line into archives. And I'm going to throw it out there already, I am living proof that you do not need an archives and records management master's, because my master's is actually in history of art. So whenever I apply for jobs which ask for that master's in particular, like it's kind of the mantra of fair museum jobs really, isn't it? I say I've got equivalent experience. And usually if it's the right organization, they factor that in basically. So yeah, I think I ended up really in archives because after I finished my role at the Cornhall, I realized that wasn't what I wanted to do. And I kind of reflected and said, actually, the job that I found fitted my way of working was archives. So I kind of used the Dolly Parton quote of find out what it is that you are and then do it on purpose. So it was at that point that I decided to really decide that archives is where I was going.
Oh, thanks so much, Sophie. That's so interesting. And I think this is our first Dolly Parton mention of the conference.
Well,
so high five to that, you know.
It had to be done. And it's, in all honesty, that is actually, I saw that quote and was like, actually, that's a really good way of working, you know, actually thinking about what it was I wanted out of a job and what I found most interesting, and then just actually doing it on purpose.
Yeah, and that ties into so much else we've talked about in this conference. Living your personal values, what you bring to work, and so on. Rosie, could we hear a little bit about your more international route, it sounds like?
Sure. Well, I think a bit like Sophie, mine's been a very weird way into this. So I'll start with, I left school and I went to art college. And then I went and did a degree in designing and making costumes for film and theatre. I then decided halfway through that I wanted to study film, but I think I left. I didn't have any money when I finished university, as I guess quite a lot of us don't really. And I went and just got temping jobs doing admin for a couple of years. I moved back to stay with my mum for a while because I just didn't really have any other choice. And I saved up, went to New Zealand, went traveling for a little bit, came back, did some more admin jobs, and I actually ended up working for the NHS, which is seemingly unrelated, but in actual fact, I've discovered since I've entered this field that I did a lot of spreadsheet work, and I think before this event started, we were sort of just talking a bit about spreadsheets. So I got a lot of experience in spreadsheets, which has proved very useful, if not the most exciting part of the job, but yeah, so I worked for the NHS for a bit, and then I eventually I did a master's studying European cinema. And I knew after that I wanted to do something film related, and I didn't know what. I just knew I wanted to do something that had something to do with film. I went back to working for the NHS because I just needed the money, and I eventually moved to Bristol because I had friends there, and I knew that there was a big film community there. So I thought I'd kind of move there, see what happened. I then went traveling to America as well. I did a bit of traveling. I worked for Ofsted in Bristol to start with because, again, I just needed a job. My background was admin, so it was just an administration job. Again, really useful because lots of transferable skills in terms of organisation and spreadsheets and managing administration and stuff. And I ended up just putting myself out there and volunteering, and the stuff that came through was film festival work. So I ended up volunteering for film festivals, and I volunteered myself into paid festival work, and eventually left my job at Ofsted to work for 2 festivals in Bristol. I was freelance for about 5 years between the 2. One of them was an African film festival called Africa Eye, and the other one was Slapstick Festival, which was they're a comedy film festival, but they're rooted in silent comedy. So it's all kind of Chaplin, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and those kind of things, amongst lots of other things, but it spreads into quite modern comedy as well. So I worked for them. Slapstick was my main sort of employment for about 3 or 4 years, and that's where I really developed an interest in the history of cinema, was through that. And yeah, that was a really interesting work. It was lots of events, and it was on the periphery of film archiving, in the fact that we screened a lot of archival film, and I did actually do some of that with the African Film Festival as well. So I worked a lot with archives. I was responsible for researching, sourcing, and shipping all the films. So I had to deal with projectionists, I had to develop relationships with film archives, I had to learn what it was to present an archive film on the screen, and all the issues that come with dealing with and presenting archival objects as they are. But in 2016, the festival that Slapstick had, I left Africa Eye actually to work more with Slapstick, because it was more my kind of, I was getting more into that. And but they had funding cuts, and I lost my job with them, unfortunately, as a result. And so I had to go back. I went back and got another NHS job for 6 months. And during that time, I kind of thought to myself, you know, what is it I really want to do? And I thought, I really want to work with film. I really want to work with the history of cinema. I'd also co-founded an organization called Southwest Silence, which is still running, which we screen silent film around the UK. So I did that in that period as well. And I kind of considered how do I work with archival film and the history of cinema and get paid? Because festival work in itself, as much as I loved it, was not well paid. I did struggle just to pay my bills. It was quite hard. And I spoke to a lot of people, and by that point I'd been going to there are some major archival film festivals in the world. So there's a couple in Italy, there's one in Bologna, and then there's one in Pordenone, which is a specifically silent film festival. So I've met a lot of archivists, I've met a lot of people within that world, and so I asked questions, and people sort of said, you know, how about becoming an archivist? Or, you know, that's you get to work with it, and you don't get paid loads of money, you know, it's not, I'm sure it's not like a massively lucrative field, but you do, you know, it was a way into earning a living in something that relating to something that I enjoyed. So, and everybody said, go to what is known as the Selznick School of Film Preservation, which is at George Eastman Museum in Rochester, in upstate New York. So it's not near New York City, it's on Lake Ontario, on the Canadian border. And so that's what I did. I applied. It was expensive. It was very expensive, unfortunately. I was in a very unique position. It coincided with me coming into a little bit of money that enabled me to do it. But it was really, really good. So that's when I went off to the US. I went off to train, because there currently isn't anywhere specifically relating in this country to train as a film and media archivist specifically, which is what I did. You know, that is what I am. I am a film and media archivist. So you kind of have to go elsewhere at the minute. There used to be one at UEA, but that doesn't run anymore. So I went off to Rochester. It was a really, really good course. It was 10 months. They do 2, I think they do a master's as well, but I did the postgraduate certificate. And then I went off to Atlanta and worked for CARE, who are a American humanitarian organization. And they've been around since just after World War II, they were founded. They sent what was known as care packages out to Europe after World War II. So Americans could send supplies to Europe and various things, so that when they exist. So they were known as care packages, but they do work all over the world now as a humanitarian organization. They're quite big. They do some amazing work, and over the years they've got an archive of their work. Their biggest attribute is probably their photographic archive. They've got thousands and thousands of photographs from around the world, which are really quite extraordinary. And when I arrived, I was employed as an intern. They'd hired an archivist a couple of years before, and they want to set up the archive. They wanted to make it publicly accessible. And so I was hired as an intern to go through their film and tape collections and see what they had, because they just didn't know. And so that was quite an extraordinary experience. The interesting thing about that was halfway through, they decided to close the project were having financial challenges. So which was not great for the archive, but it was interesting for me because I then learned how to pack up and remove an entire archive of all sorts of materials. I mean, it wasn't just film and tape. They had, you know, all sorts of things that people had brought back from around the world and stuff. So that was quite a useful experience for me, even though, like I said, it was very sad for the archive to close. And that was 4 months. I didn't stay there. I wasn't there for very long. It was a short internship, and then I got the job at the BFI, which is where I am now. So I'm an archivist in the curatorial department, which kind of is what leads the archive, I guess, as it probably does in a lot of archives. You know, curators are kind of the ones that lead what happens. So I deal with both acquisitions, so stuff coming in, and also kind of and I don't make a lot of the decisions. I make some decisions, but our team also, with the curators, also deal with kind of exhibitions, what gets screened, what gets restored, you know, as well as what we acquire. So it's quite an interesting team to work in, because you get an overview of all of the work that happens in the archive. And as I said before, I've been there about 2 years now. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Rosie. And Gary, could you just tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, sure, of course. Really, my career path, I didn't know it was a career path. It was more a rocky road when I started out. I basically was out of work for about 10 years or so. And one day the Dole office, as it was called, and as I still call it, said to me that I had to get a job. Otherwise, they would stop my £13.45p a week, which dates me. And basically, I ended up ringing up loads of libraries because I was into reading, history, always had done as a kid. And basically, one of the libraries, a local history library, said to me, well, the librarian doesn't want anybody, but the archivist might. So I put the phone down, had arranged the interview, looked in the dictionary to find out what an archivist was, didn't have a clue, and then went to meet him. And that was supposed to be a 6 weeks placement. And it turned out to be something I did on and off for about 8 years. It was something from the very first day, a bit like what Carly said. As soon as I started looking at the material, I knew that was me. It's what I wanted to do. Also, from my own confidence and trust point of view, the archivist was brilliant. Put a lot of faith in me from the beginning. From that, I got inspired to go to university and write books, which I've did. My very first job, I got working for a charity in Newham, Aston Mansfield, and that was purely based on my volunteer experience. That was great. That was working by myself, doing a lot of cataloguing. Then from there, I went to the Mercer's Company in the City of London. That was a really interesting job. They're the #1 livery company. So I was showing the Lord Mayor around every year in very surreal circumstances. And I was in charge of the gold and silver collection, including a 14th century covered cup, which was used at dinners every year, which was also an interesting challenge. So that was really, really good. Then I went on from there to the Whitechapel because I got made redundant. That was great because they had just redone their reading room, and I was part of putting the reading room up into a public gallery. So literally the gallery was next door to the reading room. So that was great. That was publicly accessible. People were coming in all the time. Involved challenges, but also great training, and great to make stuff accessible, which is my passion. And then from there, I went on to the V&A Museum of Childhood, which was great for a couple of years, left in strange circumstances. And then from there on, I went to the RAF Museum, which is brilliant because they've got access at their core. A lot of my work, well, in normal times, involves public interaction, which I love. Very much involved in acquisitions, very much involved in working with researchers, working with the public, doing my own research as well, which is brilliant stuff. Really love that. In between all that, I did an MA in intellectual and cultural history, and also obviously did my diploma in archives and records management as well. So, but you're still learning. I was doing a digital records course literally 3 weeks ago. So, you know, it still goes on, still. And for me, the volunteering, the Tower Hamlet stuff right at the beginning of my work was something that laid the core to everything else, because you can't beat the experience of working in a public reading room in a little local borough archive. That you learn a lot from there.
Oh, amazing. Thanks, Gary. And I love that emphasis on how you were treated right at the beginning of your career. So we're going to just move on a little bit now. And we've got one question about the key skills that are needed for working with museum archives. But I'd like to expand that question a little bit and sort of ask how museum archives, what's the difference, or what's the core difference to you So what are the key skills and kind of what's the difference? And can I come to you, please, Carly?
Sure. In terms of key skills, I think for me, the biggest one is patience. I think patience and understanding, because you are working with people within a museum. When it comes to curators, you're working with people who in many ways are very similar to you in terms of they're people who are responsible for a collection, but the kinds of language that they might use, the kinds of systems they use, maybe broadly similar to archives, but are also in some ways quite different. So it's that sort of patience and understanding the terminology that they use, understanding that their timelines may also be very different to yours. So for example, if a curator is working on a really important acquisition, they might be under a lot of pressure, whereas as an archivist, you might be maybe moving on a different sort of time frame. So it's trying to find the areas where your priorities line up with theirs, but also just sort of having a wider sense of compassion for people who work in museums who are sort of more are less known about and more unsung. So people like the collections management team, the documentation team, people who work front of house, people who manage the volunteers, they'll all factor into your work. Like everyone who works in a museum will have some interaction with the archive, even if only briefly. So it's sort of understanding their work and what they do, and sort of letting them know that you see them and that you understand what they do. And that makes you a better archivist in a museum as well, because if you are a museum archivist like myself, because I work at the V&A's archive and registry, so we are the archive of the museum, so the institutional archive, we archive the museum's records, the records they produce. So our records are like a mirror of all the different departments within the museum. So we have to understand what people do, how they function, how they produce their records, how they manage them, because that feeds directly into how we then catalogue and preserve the archive and manage the records as well. So in terms of sort of the difference between a museum archive and another kind of archive, it's related to that, because a museum archive is a collection about another collection, at least where I work. So you're essentially trying to keep to sort of archival standards, ideas of, provenance and sort of archival management of the records, while also being very aware of the fact that you are part of an institution that manages its collections and has an understanding of collections management that can be quite different to yours. So it's trying to find where those two things match up. And that's been the biggest challenge, but also that's the greatest reward of working as part of a museum as an archivist.
Oh, thanks so much, Carly. I love that description, a collection about another collection. That's such a great way of putting it. Gary, could we come to you on this question a little bit? Key skills and how museum archives differ.
Yeah, sure. Well, from my point of view, I think the key skills you need working in a museum in terms of working with an archive is multitasking. You're always going to be doing different things at once, never enough time to do them all properly. You have to make the time. Also, I think personal skills as well. One of the differences I think between a museum archive and any other type of archive is there's more emphasis on access. There's more emphasis on the public coming in. We would have people come in to me to ask for something. They've got a relative who was in the RAF, for instance, and I would go downstairs and chat to them and let them know what we've got. That's very much a very key personal skill, I think, in terms of being able to talk to people and also making yourself available as well. That's another big thing, I think, working in the museums. People have this idea that archivists are just like, it's all mine type golem type thing. It isn't. You're working for the organization and the organization wants you to make the records accessible. So that's what you tend to do.
Oh, thanks so much, Gary. We've had a number of questions submitted through Eventbrite. I've got a trigger happy muting button today. a lot of our questions that we've had on Eventbrite are to do with qualifications for working in museum archives. And I know people have come from different routes, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of how you have justified equivalent experience, Sophie, in your job applications.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I feel quite passionate about, actually, really, and I speak to a lot of recent graduates at UEA as part of a mentoring scheme, and they nearly always ask me, do I need to do an archives specific master's? And obviously I can't advise people one way or the other, but I always say that doing a master's is a whole year out of your life. It is expensive, as Rosie was saying earlier. It is really expensive. It's a whole year where you're not in the workplace. So only ever do a master's if the subject matter, the topics on offer are something that really, really excites you. Because otherwise, if you're trying to do it because you think it's a shortcut into getting a job, it's never ever going to work, because you have to have some kind of experience alongside that anyway. And when I was choosing my master's, it never even crossed my mind to do a more kind of vocational kind of master's. My undergrad was also history of art, and I knew that I wanted to do a master's because I wanted to go back into education and learn more. And that's what was really driving me to do it. I hadn't really considered what I would be doing after that, which is probably not the best way to go into it, really, but that's the truth of it. And so I did that because that's what I was interested in, that's what I was passionate about. And then after I left UEA doing my master's, I then was fortunate enough to get my collections management traineeship, and that was kind of an on-the-job, it was a one-year contract, on-the-job, full-time work, where you would learn a bit about the kind of background to collections management, the processes, spectrum, all that kind of stuff, alongside actually working on a large store audit project, documentation, a lot of retrospective documentation and rationalization. So we were getting rid of a lot of stuff out of the collection as well. So whenever I apply for jobs, I say, because the job I'm in at the moment, one of the essentials was to have a records management master's. And I always say, well, I don't have that, but I have got a master's, and I have got equivalent experience from my traineeship, which taught me all of the basics of what you needed to do to work in that field. And then obviously I've got the experience. I was lucky enough that the History of Advertising Trust took me on with my collections management experience, because they knew that they were expecting to get a lot of 3D objects along with the actual archival material for Butlins. So they actually saw that my unique background of collections management and that kind of historical background would benefit them. So I kind of fitted their profile not by accident, but I tailored it and not realized. And that's kind of what I try to get students and people who are wanting to go into the sector to think about, that actually, if you're really, really interested in, say, medieval history, do a master's in medieval history, and then you never know, you get experience in doing other collections management work, but a job might then come up that is working in a medieval archive, and you can say, well, I can demonstrate I'm really, really interested in that because I did my master's in that, but I've got all this other experience. So it can kind of, it all comes around in the end, I think, a lot of the time. But I mean, that is my own experience. I couldn't say, but I mean, if doing an archives master's is what really interests you, then do it. If you know that's what you're going to want to do, do it. But if you're not sure, then I think, yeah, do what you want to do.
Thanks, Sophie. Rosie, I wanted to come to you kind of on a similar note, because you took an international route, but what advice would you give to people who that is not available to, who wanted to get into film archiving?
Okay, yeah, I think, I mean, I have to say at the minute, it's something I'm very vocal about, which is that particularly in film and media archiving, I think it's slightly niche within the wider field, I guess. It's a very specific thing, it is very hard to get into without a master's level qualification. And I realized that I was extremely fortunate, given my experience and or given my circumstances, and historically that hasn't always been the case. So people could, I mean, a lot of people I work with at the BFI who have been there for many years started out doing internships and trained on the job and have been there ever since, and it's getting more and more difficult to do that. So I mean, I personally, like I say, I'm very vocal about it because I think it has become quite elitist. But having said that, I don't think that should put people off. And I do know a number of people who have come to me and asked for advice and guidance. And I would say kind of like, you know, inquire with museums and archives more widely, you know, even in not necessarily specifically film and media archives. It depends what you're interested in, obviously, but you know, reach out, talk to people. Sometimes, you know, like everyone keeps saying, you know, there are internships available, there are voluntary positions available to do stuff if you can take a little bit of time out and do that. And sort of, I would say network, because I think that's kind of how I got here, you know, aside from the qualification, I got to this point where through networking with people, and there's a lot of generous people who are willing to kind of, you know, give you advice and guidance and share their expertise. I know I certainly am willing, you know, people come to me and I do what I can to help them out and that kind of thing. But I do think, yeah, reach out, inquire, don't be afraid to speak to people and ask if there are opportunities, because I think if you're, you know, if you show willing, you know, people are interested in, you know, they want to hand that, they want to bring on the next generation of archivists. So I think it is just important to kind of be a bit bold. And it can sometimes feel quite intimidating. I know that because I've done it. Do you want to email, you know, somebody in an organization that you don't know? But I think if you're persistent enough and you kind of get on their radar, that can be quite a good way to do it. So that would be my kind of feeling. I think if you can't do that, it's just try and get as much experience as possible.
Thanks so much, Rosie. And Carly, could I just bring you in on the point about qualifications as well? What's your perspective on it?
My perspective is that it's a really interesting time in archives right now to be talking about qualifications. The archive community is currently working on an archivist and records manager apprenticeship model, which is coming sort of towards near the end of its development, and they're sort of gearing up to do the final stages to get the apprenticeship approved. So it's part of the government's wider apprenticeship scheme. There are already apprenticeships on library and archive assistant roles. The idea of the apprenticeship is basically it gives the opportunity for someone to get an apprenticeship within an archives or records organization and to learn all the skills necessary to become a fully fledged sort of archivist and records manager, but without having to do a formal degree. And these apprenticeships are designed for people without any prior experience or qualification in archives and records management. There was a lot of debate about the apprenticeship, whether we should be doing it at all. As archivists, we've worked very hard to be seen as a profession in our own right. And so there was this sort of fear that it would be diluting the profession. That debate still kind of rages, which is unfortunate. I'm very much in favour apprenticeship, so I've been watching it develop, and I'm really excited to see it happen. And there are also other internships that are currently running. So there's bridging the digital gap traineeship, which is being run by the National Archives, which is really interesting. That's also for people without prior experience, but they get to do sort of paid work in archives and learn particularly from a digital perspective about archival work. And it's a really sort of interesting way of bringing in people from more diverse backgrounds. I mean, the archive and records management sector is not hugely diverse, particularly from sort of a racial perspective. So that's been really interesting for me to watch that develop. I did get a master's in archives and records management, which I don't regret at all. I loved it, but I'm someone with a very sort of academic kind of background anyway, and also I was lucky enough to get a full grant to do it. So that paid off my fees and also gave me a maintenance grant. So I didn't accrue any debt in getting my master's, and that's just so rare now. And it's unfortunate that those grants don't continue to exist. And I think that has been damaging to the profession in terms of making it more diverse and more accessible. So I'm really in favor of seeing things like apprenticeships come up and internships. If someone is thinking, should they do a master's, if you really want to do it, definitely give it a try. There are some amazing courses up and down the country, but also be aware that there are distance learning courses as well and modular courses. So I think Dundee does them, Aberystwyth. So you can do distance courses, or if you don't want to do a full master's, you can do, say, just a short module in a particular archival skill if you do want to get that formal training as well. But don't underestimate the importance of hands-on experience, voluntary experience, internship work. We recently recruited for a couple of interns as part of the V&A's DCamp project, because we're moving out of Blythe House, and the 2 interns that we took in, I mean, it's a pre-qualification role, but the 2 interns we took in had relatively little archive experience, and they were in the job, they were up against people who'd done PhDs, but we chose them because they were able to map the experience they had from their other kinds of work, so admin work, front-facing customer service work, and apply it, and they were able to apply it to the job description. They showed that they had the skills and the experience, so it wasn't about the qualifications. It was really about seeing someone and realizing they wanted the job and that they could do the job. So I think just really be honest with yourself, and also lastly, be really aware of one of the best things about being an archivist is that there's a huge focus on continued professional development. So just because you've gotten qualified, it doesn't mean you stop learning. You're going to be learning throughout your career in both formal and informal ways. So don't worry too much about the experience, the qualifications you get at the start, because you are going to be just sort of growing and growing and growing throughout your career anyway.
That's amazing. I'm so stoked to hear about those changes, Kylie. Like, that's incredible to hear. Museums, take note. About the content of the role. Why does it mute all the time? And I wanted to start with what's the kind of biggest misconception about your role? And could I come to you, please, Gary?
Yeah, sure. Well, sort of what I mentioned slightly earlier is that the biggest misconception of archivists is that they're got sandals, covered in dust, and got a beard. When I used to say that, I had neither, but now I've got the beard, so it's slightly worrying. Basically, they just have one stereotype of somebody in dusty archives, and like it's all like my archives. Nobody's supposed to look at this. You know, it's all very precious stuff. You're not allowed to touch it. I've done archive classes with groups of 7-year-olds, which maybe explains why I'm grey now, but it's also a brilliant experience where you're talking to them. I think that's the biggest misconception. The other misconception, I think, is, well, it's partly to do with a master's, really. Everybody thinks you need to do a master's. I did a diploma, which is another version of the master's, a shorter version. And a lot of my classmates at the time, they were all registered for masters but ended up doing diplomas as well, because not many of them could face writing 10,000 words on records management, understandably. So they all end up doing that, and also they all got jobs at the time, so that was really good. And also I think the other biggest misconception is we all come from very big massive academic backgrounds, and we don't. We all come from completely different various backgrounds as well, and that's the great thing about being an archivist, really, that you meet people from different backgrounds. We're all passionate, we're all geeks about what we do, but we're all from very different backgrounds as well.
Thanks so much, Gary. And Rosie, what are the misconceptions about film archivists?
I think the biggest one with film archivists is that we only look after really old films, when actually film archiving, I mean, I try and say film and media archiving, because it's not just film. Personally, my personal passion and love is old film, but we deal with everything, you know, like we deal with tape. Tape is one of the biggest things. So, you know, your cassette tape formats that were very, very big for many years, open reel tapes and and cassette tapes. The BFI is in the middle of a massive kind of tape digitization project now, which I'm working on. So there's a lot of stuff like that, and we deal with digital. Like, I don't think anybody ever thinks of archives and digital stuff really in the wider world, but you know, I mean, archiving digital materials, I don't know, it's perhaps the same with everyone else, is one of the most challenging things right now, because it's such a new medium, and we're not so used to dealing with it as we are with film, which has been around for sort of, you know, a good 100 odd years. We kind of know what to do with film. So yeah, I think lots of people think, oh, you know, you just work with old films, but we don't. And on the back of that, like, a lot of people sometimes just think that the film is the only interesting thing, and all the other stuff is rather boring. But it's not. You know, tape and digital are also really, really interesting. And yeah, I think sort of the same as what Gary was saying, which is that people, you know, do have that perception of an archivist as some old guy sitting in a basement somewhere, you know, collecting dust, and that it's really boring, which it's not. It's fascinating, you know, hence why I do it. I love the, you know, I love the diversity of it and all the different things that you get to do, and the research and the curiosity. So yeah, that's probably what I would say is the biggest misconceptions.
Thanks so much, Rosie. I saw we had a question in the chat about how to find internships and placements, and I'd like to tie that with another question we had. So how do you find internships and placements, and also how do you get the most out of them if you are successful with one? And could I come to you on that, Carly, to begin with?
Yeah, sure. In terms of finding placements, cast a wide net, definitely. There are lots of listservs that you can join up to mailing lists. For example, there's the Archives or NRA listserv, which is a JISC listserv. A lot of archival apprenticeships get put up there, but also look at various other mailing lists that are available in the heritage sector, and also sort of step outside of that as well if you can. So more general job websites like Indeed are really good, and a lot of organizations advertise via The Guardian as well, especially if they're a larger organization. They might have a separate HR team, and they'll have like a list of various places that they'll advertise sort of all roles to. You can set up Google alerts as well for various kinds of job roles that come up. So definitely cast a wide net. And if you're able to join any professional organizations, that can sometimes accrue a fee, but there are other organizations where you can join up to mailing lists for free and find out about various job roles. In terms of making the most out of a placement when you get one, I would recommend keeping an open mind, especially if you're working in a museum archive or an archive that's part of a very sort of larger organization with lots of diverse job roles. Don't be afraid to work with members of staff who are not, you know, part of the archive, or who are not working specifically on archival tasks. When I was at the Horniman, I helped design an internship where it was all based around a single collection. It was a collection of a family called the Brain family, who had lived in the Sudan. They're a British family, but lived in Sudan in the 1950s. And they had this amazing collection of archives, including film material, and a lot of objects as well, including textiles and costumes. And that collection had sort of languished in our stores, driving the collections management team crazy for like a good couple of years, because the curator who was working on it was also on maternity leave, so it was a whole thing. So we designed an internship where we had an intern come in, and she split her time between me working with the archive and the slide collection. She worked with one of our documentation officers to measure, mark, label, and document the collection on our collections management system. She worked with our photographer to photograph the objects from the really, really tiny ones to huge textiles that they had to sort of figure out how to pin up on the walls and things. And she also worked with the curator to do research in the collection. And she went with us to the London Metropolitan Archive, because the London Screen Archives actually had the equipment to let us view the film. So she ended up getting an amazing range of different skills and a much broader understanding of the different jobs that go on within a museum. And that really, really was key. I'm not sure if she's going to go on to do like a museum archive type work. It wasn't really the point, but the point of the internship was to get her a holistic understanding of the way the organization worked and the way we all work together. Because if you work in a museum archive or just any decent archive, you're not going to be working in a silo, you're going to be working with other people. So that's the thing you need to understand. If they just put you in a room with one collection for you to like catalog, that's nice experience. But if you can get out of that room and see the way the archivist works with other people and with members of the public and other stakeholders, that's the really, really good experience. That's like the gold star level of experience.
Oh, thanks so much, Carly. That sounds Sophie, would you be able to tell us a little bit about how to get the most out of a placement? I'm aware of time as well. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything that Carly and Rosie were saying. Absolutely, try and do as much as you can within that space that you've been given. Try and work with different departments if you can, because that'll give you a really good overview of also what other departments do, because if you're not 100% sure you want to do archives and that kind of work, it will give you an idea that you might decide, oh, actually I really like learning, or I really like exhibitions or curatorial work, and that might lead you in a slightly different direction. I absolutely join the GIST mail if you're not on the GIST mail, because that's where everything happens pretty much. And in terms of actually finding a placement as well, I think it's important to be realistic about where you can get to from where you're based. So I mean, failing actually just drawing a circle on a map to say I can get there physically within like a day, and then finding the organizations within that kind of radius that you can get to. And then, like Rosie was saying, just approach people. I think not everywhere is going to be advertising for roles, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to take on really interesting volunteers or placement students if someone approaches them. So that's really, really important. And I think also kind of almost reflecting and actually looking at the bigger picture of the organization to figure out if that's something that you want in your future. Whether it is a really diverse, dynamic team, whether it is quite a quiet workplace, think about where you've worked before and where that kind of fits into what you want to do, and think about that, because if you want to do it in the future, that's going to be your potentially 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and think that way. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I think we've covered like a huge range of things here, but just a final question to end on is, could you tell us and tell the audience a little bit about one project that you're really proud of that has happened in your career? And could I start with you, please, Gary?
Yeah, sure. This sounds incredibly geeky, but every time I do, I bring in any archive material into the archive, catalogue it and make it available, and then a researcher looks at it. That's an incredibly proud moment. I still get a kick from opening an acid-free box and looking inside the folders and looking at the documents, and that's probably why I'm an archivist, really.
I love it. And Rosie?
Yeah, this is hard. There are so many. I think I agree with Gary on the, like, well, for me, opening, a can of basically a film can and seeing what's inside. I think actually one of the projects that I am proudest of is one I'm right in the middle of, which I can't give details of, unfortunately, but it is essentially it's a video diary collection, and it's basically uncut material of people's own personal experiences, and I'm really enjoying I'm going through selecting that content right now to make parts of it available, and it's just it's a real eye-opener, because you're getting a whole breadth of ordinary people talking about their experiences in life. And I sort of love the bit you get the bars and tone at the beginning of the video, and then you get this little bit of black, and then the video diary starts, and you've got no idea what you're about to see. But it is so diverse, the content, the material, the people that are talking, and I think I just feel like I'm really proud of the fact that I'm getting to make these things available for people, really, and so that's probably my proudest project at the moment.
And Sophie, please.
Yeah, so absolutely agree with Gary and Rosie. The excitement of actually opening stuff up and finding new things and then being able to make them accessible is so rewarding. And I really like bringing order where there is chaos, and that's kind of what I've been doing a lot in a lot of my jobs, is being faced with a lot of a mess that needs to be ordered, and doing that, because then the collection can kind of reach its potential and kind of be its best self, basically, out in the world. And that was really highlighted at my job when I was at Bletchley. When I started, I kind of realized that we were having a lot of issues with being actually able to find stuff in the archive, which you wouldn't ordinarily think would be a massive issue, but actually sometimes that is if you haven't recorded your locations properly. So when researchers and exhibitions teams or anyone, the marketing teams, were trying to say, can I see these items here? We would actually only be able to find about 40–50% of those items. And that's obviously a massive issue. So I instigated a huge location audit of the collections, working with a small team of volunteers. And we kind of systematically went through everything and double checked all the locations. And we were actually finding when I left, we couldn't completely finish it before I left, but we were getting much more, like 80% of the stuff off the list we're being able to find. And that was so rewarding because it meant so much more of the collection was getting out there in the world and being able to be looked at and used. And I'm sure had I stayed and carried on, we would have been able to find everything, because unless someone's stolen it, it's going to be in there somewhere. So yeah.
I love bringing order where there is chaos. Lots of nods to that. And Carly, what have you been most proud of?
I'm most proud currently of working with the section for archives and museums. We're the newest special interest group within the Archives and Records Management and the Archives and Records Association. I'm their training officer, so I've been able to work with a group of people, archivists and conservators, who have a dual interest in archives and museums. So we were created to encourage an exchange of skills and knowledge between people who work in archives and with records and people who work in museums. It's been really great. Last week I ran a training workshop, a virtual training workshop with a freelance museum consultant named Anita Hollinshead on storing, packing and moving small and medium-sized object collections. And so it was teaching people who are working archives who may have objects, and it's teaching them how to care for those objects. So that was really rewarding. We started a podcast this year, and in our most recent episode we were able to interview Louise from Fair Museum Jobs about fair recruitment in the heritage sector. Really eye-opening, a really popular episode, and so that was something we were really blessed to do. And next year we'll be doing a sort of a virtual rerun of our training workshop, which is called Museum Collections Management for Archivists. So we might change the title, but basically it's an intro to museum collections management, documentation and the museum sector for people who are interested but don't know much about it yet. So that will be coming next year. So that's something that I've really been enjoying this past couple of years.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our hour is over, and I am so sad about this because I've enjoyed hearing from you all so much. I hope everyone who's in the audience will join me in thanking Rosie and Sophie and Carly and Gary for their time, and I thank everyone in the audience for coming and listening as well. We hope to make the recording available in the coming weeks, so please do pass it on. I've learnt loads. And I'm also feeling really inspired to make changes in my museum career from listening to people kind of in and outside the sector. So thank you for sharing that with me. And yeah, thanks so much. We'll probably have a slightly awkward pause and then say goodbye to everyone. Such is the way of Zoom. But massive thanks to everyone. Thank you.